Let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself wishing that someone finally realized what they had in you after they lost you? Maybe you were the one who showed up, you gave, you waited, you forgave, you bent until you broke, and now that you're gone, or trying to be, they suddenly seem more curious, more interested, or worse, totally unaffected. But here's what I want to challenge today. What if the goal isn't to make him miss you? What if the real power is in becoming someone he simply doesn't recognize anymore? Someone so self-possessed, so evolved, that the version of you he once knew, she doesn't exist anymore. Today isn't about revenge. It's not about manipulation. It's about transformation. It's about becoming the kind of woman whose absence teaches the lesson her presence never could. Let's talk about how to do exactly that. The first keynote. The old you was familiar, but familiar isn't always valued. Speaks to a dynamic so many people miss in relationship sale. We often assume that the more someone knows us, the more they'll appreciate us. But in reality, familiarity can breed complacency. When someone becomes used to you always being there, always forgiving, always available, they stop actively choosing you. You become background noise instead of music they have to lean in to hear. Think about it, when a person knows exactly how you'll respond, when you're constantly emotionally accessible, when your boundaries are soft or inconsistent, they stop having to earn your attention. They stop feeling any urgency to show up in the right way. And often, it's not even malicious. It's just human nature. We take what's predictable for granted. We mentally file it under always there and move on to whatever is more novel, more challenging, or more uncertain. And that's the trap. You become familiar, and in doing so, you become invisible in all the ways that matter. This doesn't mean that kindness, love, or loyalty are mistakes. They aren't. But when those things are given without limits or expectation, especially to someone who hasn't earned them, they lose their weight. Your consistency becomes convenience. Your affection becomes assumed. And when something is assumed, it's no longer cherished. It's just expected. Now, when that version of you begins to disappear, when you stop texting back instantly, when you no longer light up at breadcrumbs, when you don't tolerate the bare minimum, the energy shifts. Suddenly, they notice. Not because you're trying to make them notice, but because the rhythm they relied on has changed. You've disrupted their certainty. You've taken away the version of you they had constant, unearned access to. And here's the key, it's not about pretending. It's not about playing games or manufacturing distance just to create longing. It's about authentically evolving. You're no longer that version of yourself because that version was built around overgiving, over-explaining, and overcompensating. She was tired. She wanted love so badly she forgot to protect her own. And when you finally start showing up for yourself, the way you used to show up for him, everything changes. The version of you that tolerated late replies, hot and cold attention, empty promises, and lukewarm effort. She's gone. And that absence, the one they'd ever feel, is what creates the gap. That's what triggers the sense of loss. Not because they lost a partner, necessarily, but because they lost the emotional cushion that let them stay lazy. They lost the version of you who kept the connection alive on her own. And suddenly they have to face the silence, the lack of reaction, the shift in energy that says, you don't get to come back to the same version of me you mistreated. Ironically, it's the familiarity they once ignored that now haunts them. The way you used to be. The texts, the effort, the softness. They miss it, but not in the way you might think. They miss the comfort. They miss the control. But what they really miss is the version of you that allowed them to be passive and still be loved. And when that version is gone, they're left with one question. Who is she now? That's the moment you've reclaimed your power. Not because they're missing you, but because you're no longer waiting to be missed. You're no longer operating from a place of needing to be seen, because you finally see yourself. You don't need to convince someone to miss you. You don't need to craft perfect messages, post cryptic Instagram stories, or subtly hint at your absence. That's not where your power is. The real shift happens when you become emotionally inaccessible in a way that can't be faked. It's when you remove the access they once had, not just to your time, but to your emotional availability, your loyalty, your softness, your patience. Because the truth is, most people don't realize the privilege they had in accessing those parts of you until they're locked out. Emotional access is the most undervalued currency in modern relationships. Someone can lose romantic interest, drift away, or even break up with you, and still believe they can check in whenever they want. They might think they can still reach out when they feel lonely, still get comfort when things go wrong, still feel reassured that you're there, in some quiet corner of their world, just waiting. This access isn't about physical presence. It's about the belief that they still matter deeply to you, that they can still stir you, that you still feel something for them. And as long as they believe that access is available, they feel no real urgency to change. Why would they? There's no real consequence to losing you if you never fully walk away. But something powerful happens when that access is gone, not withdrawn in anger, not taken away to manipulate, just no longer offered. Your responses change. The tone in your voice softens, not with love, but with indifference. You stop explaining yourself. You stop defending your worth. You stop leaning in. That's the moment they feel the shift, even if you never say a word. See, when someone loses emotional access to you, they're no longer part of your inner world. They're not updated on how you're doing. They don't get insight into your heart. They aren't the first person you run to with news, or the last voice you hear before bed. And that's when the discomfort sets in, because before, they might have left the relationship, but they still felt emotionally tethered to you. They knew they could still influence your emotions. And when that disappears, what they feel isn't just loss. It's disorientation. The key is that this isn't a performance. You're not withholding to get a reaction. You're simply no longer offering a version of yourself to someone who didn't respect it. It's a quiet, grounded withdrawal. It's deciding that the emotional safety you once gave away so freely now needs to be earned. That your vulnerability is no longer a default. It's a privilege. This is why trying to make someone miss you often backfires. When your actions are still based on their perception, you're still emotionally available. You're still orbiting their attention. But when you pull your energy away, not to teach a lesson, but because your boundaries have evolved, they feel the absence in a different way. They don't just miss you because you're not around. They miss the version of you they had easy access to. And that version no longer exists. That's when they start questioning. Why aren't you reacting? Why don't they get the same version of you anymore? It's not rejection. It's irrelevance. And that's much harder to ignore. They begin to realize that the game is no longer being played, that the rules have changed, and that they're no longer invited to play the role they once did. By removing their access to you, you're not punishing them. You're protecting yourself. You're reclaiming your emotional bandwidth and choosing to offer it only to those who meet you with presence, clarity, and effort. The person who thought they could come and go as they pleased now has to face something they didn't expecting, a door that no longer opens, and a woman who no longer waits on the other side. Reinvention is more powerful than revenge because it shifts your focus inward instead of outward. Revenge keeps your energy tied to someone else. It's reactive, often emotionally charged, and still rooted in a need for recognition or closure. Reinvention, on the other hand, is quiet. It's not about making else feel something. It's about becoming someone so aligned, so self-aware, that their opinion no longer carries weight. You're not trying to make them watch you grow. You're growing whether they're watching or not. When a relationship ends or begins to fade, especially one where you gave more than you received, the temptation to prove your worth can be overwhelming. Maybe you want to show them what they lost. Maybe you want to post the right picture, say the right thing, drop a subtle hint that you're doing better than ever. But the truth is, if you're still looking over your shoulder to see if they notice, you're still tied to their validation. You're still playing the same emotional game, just from a different angle. Reinvention breaks that pattern. It's the decision to evolve, not for applause, not for attention, but because staying the same would cost you your peace. It's waking up one day and realizing that the version of you that tolerated chaos, begged for clarity, or settled for less isn't someone you want to be anymore. And instead of trying to convince them to regret losing you, you quietly become someone they no longer have access to. That's where the real shift happens. Most people try to move on by replacing the other person or distracting themselves. But distraction isn't transformation. Reinvention happens when you sit with the pain, the questions, the silence, and choose to rebuild anyway. You reflect on the parts of you that accepted half effort, that gave away too much emotional labor, that feared walking away because of what it might say about your worth. And you begin to rewrite that story. Not with a new partner, not with curated posts, but with real, internal change. And here's the irony: when you reinvent yourself from a place of truth, the very people who took you for granted start to notice. Maybe not right away, but eventually they sense the difference. The dynamic has changed. You're no longer available in the same way. You don't respond with the same softness. You're not angry. You're just unreachable. And that distance is far more unsettling than rage or sadness. You're not acting. You're not playing hard to get. You've just genuinely outgrown the version of yourself who needed their attention to feel enough. That's what makes reinvention so powerful. It doesn't require them to validate your growth. It doesn't hinge on their reaction. It's yours. You own it. You build it piece by piece through self-respect, new standards, emotional discipline, and the kind of confidence that doesn't need to be broadcasted. You stop chasing closure because you realize you've already closed the door. Not on them, necessarily, but on the person you were when you let them define your worth. Reinvention is subtle. It's in the way you carry yourself. It's in the people you now allow into your life. It's in the boundaries you enforce without drama. The silence that once felt like a punishment now feels like peace. And without even trying, you become the version of yourself they never saw coming. The one who doesn't need to be remembered to feel whole. The one who doesn't just move on, but rises. And when they finally notice, it's too late. Not because you've become bitter, but because you've become better. Emotionally unavailable men don't usually miss you when you're still emotionally attached. They might miss the attention, the validation, or the comfort you provided, but they don't truly feel your absence. Because on some level, they still believe they have you. You may have stopped texting first, or you're trying to set boundaries, but if your heart is still deeply tied to them, they can feel that. Emotional attachment has a way of bleeding through your words, your silence, even your social media. And someone who has learned how to feed off that emotional access will keep returning as long as they know you still care. Even if you're pretending not to. What really makes an emotionally unavailable man feel your absence is emotional detachment. Not indifference born from bitterness, but a quiet letting go. It's when you've emotionally moved on, not just physically removed yourself. That's when the power dynamic shifts. Because as long as you're still caught in the push-pull of, does he miss me? Or, should I reply to this text? Or maybe he just needs more time. You're giving him emotional control without him having to invest anything. He's still the center of your attention, even if he's not showing up for you. But when you no longer engage with that pattern, not out of spite, but because you've emotionally matured beyond it, he starts to feel something very different. He senses that the emotional cord has been cut, that he can no longer stir the same response in you, that his charm, his inconsistency, his moments of effort followed by withdrawal, none of it works anymore. And that's the moment it hits. Because someone who is emotionally unavailable isn't used to being shut out. They're used to people waiting, hoping, staying open, even if it hurts. So when you become someone who has stopped waiting, not loudly but in a calm, grounded way. It's unsettling for them. It's not about ignoring them to get a reaction. That's still giving energy to the cycle. It's about getting to a place where you genuinely no longer need anything from them. Not a message, not an apology, not even closure. You're not angry, you're not playing games, you're just not interested. You're focused elsewhere, on your healing, your peace, your boundaries, your future. And because emotional availability is something they don't know how to give, they don't know how to process someone who demands it. So they start looking back, they replay the past, they miss the version of you that made love feel easy, even when it was hard on you. Emotionally unavailable men often romanticize the person they pushed away after that person has finally detached. They start missing what they didn't appreciate when it was right in front of them. But by the time they feel the loss, the opportunity is gone. And if you've truly done the work, you won't be tempted to reopen the door. Because the version of you who needed to be chosen by someone emotionally unavailable no longer exists. That's the paradox. The more you try to get someone to miss you, the less effective it is. But the moment you stop trying, the moment you detach, the moment you start choosing yourself fully, that's when the impact lands. And it's not just about them missing you. It's about you finally understanding that their emotional unavailability was never your responsibility to fix. It was just your cue to leave. And when you finally walk away without looking back, you don't just leave the relationship. You leave the role you played in it. You stop showing up for someone who never truly showed up for you. And that's when they finally realize what they had right, as you realize you no longer want it. You don't need to explain your growth to anyone, especially not to the person who ignored it when they had full access to you. Evolution doesn't come with announcements. It doesn't need permission, justification, or validation. Real change isn't loud. It doesn't look like a bold declaration or a dramatic speech about what you will or won't tolerate anymore. It looks like changed behavior, like walking away instead of pleading, like silence instead of over-explaining, like detachment instead of reactivity. That's the difference between trying to prove a point and actually having moved on. People are far more impacted by what they can feel than what they are told. You can tell someone you've changed, that you've grown, that you're different now, but if your energy still feels like you're waiting for them to notice, to apologize, or to chase you, the message doesn't land. But when your energy is clean, when you're no longer performing, when you're no longer emotionally available in the same way, that's when the shift becomes undeniable. They can feel that something is different, even if you never say a word. Think about the patterns they were used to. Maybe you used to respond quickly. Maybe you'd over-clarify how you felt to avoid conflict. Maybe you'd forgive easily, rationalize their inconsistency, or wait for breadcrumbs just to stay connected. They knew your rhythms. They knew how to press your buttons. They knew what kind of message would get you to open back up. So when you no longer play into that, it's not just confusing, it's disruptive. They don't know how to handle the new you because the rules have changed. And more importantly, you're no longer participating in the old game. That's the real power in not explaining yourself. You let your actions speak. You let your silence say what words no longer need to carry. And it's not because you're trying to be mysterious or strategic. It's because you've outgrown the need to be understood by someone who refused to understand you when it mattered. You realize that your peace is too valuable to keep handing over to people who only want to negotiate your boundaries. You're no longer seeking clarity from someone who only brought confusion. They might circle back. Maybe they sense the difference and reach out. Maybe they try to trigger the old version of you with messages that once worked. But this time, your response is different. Or maybe there's no response at all. Not because you're trying to get back at them, but because there's truly nothing left to say. The version of you who needed to explain her worth is gone. The version who thought love meant proving, fixing, or sacrificing is no longer at the wheel. That's when they finally notice. Not when you post about your healing. Not when you try to sound strong or look unbothered. They notice when their old tools stop working. When they can't find a crack to crawl back into. When they sense that your energy is no longer directed at them. You're no longer trying to be seen. You've already seen yourself. And in doing so, you've made the old story irrelevant. You never needed to beg someone to recognize your value. You just needed to stop trying to convince them and start acting like you believe it yourself. And once you do, you won't need to show them what they lost. They'll realize it the moment they can't find the version of you they took for granted. Not because you told them, but because they finally felt your absence where they used to feel your presence. At first, the desire to be missed feels almost irresistible. It's tied to your need for validation, for closure, for some kind of emotional payoff after everything you gave. You want to believe that your absence will create a void. That at some point, he'll look back and realize what he lost. And maybe for a while that thought gives you something to hold on to. It makes the silence feel purposeful, the pain feel worthwhile. But what you begin to understand over time is that waiting to be missed is just another form of emotional dependence. It keeps your power outside of you, tied to someone else's awareness instead of your own healing. The most liberating part of your growth is not when he misses you. It's when you no longer care whether he does. That's the real evolution. It's subtle, but it changes everything. You stop checking for signs. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You stop wondering if he's watching your stories or thinking about you late at night. Because you're not living for that anymore. You're not living in reaction to his absence. You're living from a place that is finally yours. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, often after many moments of frustration, of longing, of trying to convince yourself you're over it when you're not. But then one day, you realize you've gone hours or days without thinking about him. You realize your peace has taken up the space where his presence used to live. You're no longer motivated by a need to be remembered. You're focused on rebuilding, on reconnecting with the parts of yourself you silenced just to keep someone else close. And when this happens, something interesting occurs. The narrative changes. It's no longer about what he's thinking or feeling. It's about what you want, what you need, and what you no longer accept. You might even look back at the version of yourself that waited to be missed and feel a kind of tenderness. Because she didn't know her power yet. She hadn't yet realized that the greatest thing she could gain from that experience wasn't attention or regret or a second chance. It was indifference. Not coldness, not bitterness, just freedom. You don't wish him harm. You don't need him to feel pain. You've simply reached a place where his opinion, his validation, his absence, none of it holds the emotional weight it once did. That's what makes this version of you so powerful. Not because you're trying to prove anything, but because you no longer need to. Your value is no longer up for discussion. It's not something you're trying to get someone to see. It's something you carry now, with quiet confidence, in the way you speak to yourself, in the choices you make, in the people you now allow into your space. This is the version of you he'll never know, the one who no longer tolerates being an option, the one who doesn't beg for clarity, the one who doesn't chase closure, the one who simply outgrew the need to be chosen by someone who never truly saw her. And if he ever does miss you, it won't matter. Because by then, you'll be long gone, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Not because you turned cold, but because you turned inward. Because you stopped trying to be enough for someone else and finally realized you were already more than enough on your own. You don't get your power back by trying to make someone feel your absence. You get your power back by realizing that their awareness is no longer your goal. The version of you that gave endlessly, explained constantly, waited patiently, that version served her purpose. She loved deeply, she showed up, she tried, but she's gone now. Not because she was weak, but because you're finally strong enough to let her go. And what replaces her is not a colder, harder version of you. It's a wiser one with boundaries, one who no longer lowers her standards just to feel chosen, one who doesn't need to be missed, because she's no longer missing herself. You're not here to haunt his memory. You're here to come home to yourself. And when that happens, when you evolve into the version of you who no longer fits inside the old story, that's when the story truly ends. Not with revenge, not with being missed, but with your freedom.